Okay. Hi guys, welcome.
Yo, let us to
What's
stay in,
that?
bruh.
What's that? Did you just learn how to
Oh
speak?
my god.
Oh. Oh.
Oh.
Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Jillian Custard, and this would be season 2, episode 3. Stay tuned and hope you enjoy.
Ungovernable.
So, what's new, guys?
Fucking
Aiden,
ungovernable,
how
bro.
you? How's the work, bro? How's things? What's
Work is
of
good.
interest?
A lot of first years who are always fun to work with. And we've been talking about debates around land in South Africa, debates around like we're talking about the Mfikane, which for those listeners who are not from South Africa is the way in which historians have spoken about a lot of changes that happened in Southern Africa in the 19th century. And we kind of talk about like how people have interpreted that and stuff, and then talk about how some of those interpretations have led to the depiction of the Zulu kingdom, for example, as like warring and violent and things like that. So yeah, and it's been really interesting. I think that, there's a lot of young people in this country who are really keen to engage with the history of this country. And yeah, I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it so far. Yeah.
So I have a question on that. How is it going in terms of battling preconceptions about, say, for instance, the Zulu kingdom? Like how is it navigating the general assumption that what we have as a depiction of the Zulu kingdom is kind of this kind of universal truth? Like, because obviously a lot of what you're doing is revising, or I think a lot of what university work is doing is revising some of those myths and like thinking about how those myths come to be constructed, but then how do we like move beyond those myths? How do we complicate them? How do we unpack them and stuff like that? So I'm just wondering, in a class of 200 people, how do you begin to contend with those kinds of assumptions, preconceptions and stuff like that?
I think it's very difficult. Like, obviously, when one speaks about like Shaka, when you talk about like the Zulu kingdom, there's obviously a lot attached to that, right? And part of what I'm trying to do, and what the students are trying to do, is to think about, okay, so here are these events that we know about, right? We know, for example, that Shaka centralized his kingdom and expanded it, right? He centralized the role of his of the Amabuto, like he centralized that kind of I guess you could call them like a warrior class. He centralized them and he used them to kind of advance into other spaces, right? And the knock-on effects of that are recorded by both oral traditions and missionaries and European explorers, etc., etc. But then we also know there is this kind of movement by the British, by the Portuguese. There's slave trading going on, like the Griqua also slave trading in the region. And all of these are contributing factors to the movement of people across Southern Africa, right? And then we say like, okay, so what happens when historians later on take that evidence and construct it in an argument to say, Africans were fighting amongst themselves, and the result of that is that the land was empty when Europeans arrived.
Right.
So we kind of like unpack that. We say, okay, so how are people using the evidence that we know about to say like to make other things, other kind of narratives about Southern Africa, about the history of Southern Africa, about who belongs in Southern Africa. How do they make those things believable, right? And how can we think about the evidence differently?
Yeah.
And then we say like, okay, so if the idea of the Mfikane, if we read it as, say, solely caused by the Zulu, then we have an image of the Zulu as violent, as,
Yeah.
you know, as warring, as defensive. And what that does is it says that there is a particular way to think about Zulu-ness or being Zulu. Or,
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And then we look at, like, for example,
That lost into the contemporary moment, right? Like that.
Yeah.
That perception, that
So,
image.
So there's
anyway.
So like one of the examples that I use that like we engage with is the video game, the computer game called Civilization 6, which has the Zulu. You can play as the Zulu, right? And there's this great interview, which I think we should put down in the show notes, between Professor T.J. Tali, who's a scholar of Zulu history, and he walks through, and he's also a big Civilization 6 player. So, and he walks through the ways in which like the representations of Shaka in that thing are like based on the images of Henry Tele. Yeah, not Becky Tele.
Yeah.
Henry Tele, who played Shaka Zulu in the film, I think in the miniseries, right?
The miniseries, yeah.
Yeah, and so we look at like, so he kind of like explores that, and we'd ask like, okay, so why is it that in Civilization 6, the Zulu as a civilization in the game, like their stats are heavily skewed towards like contact, like melee contact fighting, and like the Impi is like a strong warrior, right? Like where does that come from? What is that idea? You know, what did it mean for the Zulu to be like really good, like technologically, or like, you know, what other evidence is there of the way in which the Zulu state evolved that does not end in like them just being a warring nation?
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of debates that we kind of touch on. And I think it's like, it's so important to also interrogate some of those things, because it says that, it says like there's only one way to be Zulu, and these narratives are like very, they fix people, right? They fix people in particular ways. They say like, you know, you can't be anything but a certain idea of a certain kind of traditional, I think that's, so we're trying to unpack that and think about it a bit more. It's been fun. It's been interesting. Like, I think the thing is that a lot of people don't realize, but like the youth in this country are eager to engage these topics. Like they want to talk about it. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, for sure.
How was the responses of some like Zulu people in the class? Because I wonder how much of that like outside definition of one's culture they would kind of adopt themselves. You know what I mean? Like you get told, like you're a Zulu person and you get told all these things and see all these things about what defines a Zulu person, and then you tend to believe that as well, you know, especially in modernization. Like I wonder if there was like some realization where like, oh shit, like we weren't just about this, about fighting, about being what we had such and such, we had actually a good oral tradition, or we had good like, I don't know, cultural stuff, like, you know, and I see what you're getting at. And I think it's important because when a culture gets defined or seen as just this one thing, then it's also easy for people to then adopt that for themselves. Like, oh, I am this now. Like, this is what I am. And I think that's what you always spoke about, Aiden, of like ethnicity versus culture. And like, being careful not to think of both of them as the same, but kind of intertwined, you know, in ways that make a person kind of whole, I think, in a sense of their place within their culture or their ethnicity.
Yeah, I think like you can't the point that I'm trying to make is like, you have traditions, right? And you have narratives about belonging, narratives about culture, you have cultural traditions, etc. And there's nothing entirely wrong, or I guess one of the things is that we're trying to explore is the ways in which certain ideas about tradition become fixed, and says like there is this particular idea of tradition, and then there's kind of like modern. And if you are traditional, then you can't be modern. And if you're modern, you can't be traditional, kind of, you know, and these categories are something that we need to trouble, because I mean, if there's anything about tradition, if there's anything that's true about tradition, is that tradition changes. Like, you know, that's the first thing. And the second thing, if there's anything we know about tradition in Africa, it's that it was deeply affected by the mechanisms of colonialism that produced like tribal authorities that mechanized tradition in a particular way to serve the interests of colonialism, and particularly the British. I mean, the word tribe is an example, right? I always say, like, if you Google the word tribe, you know, we use tribe so innocently, like in everyday life. We say, you know, you can join like a loyalty program, and it's called like My Tribe or something, right? But if you look up the word tribe, if you Google it and you click on Google Images and you see what comes up, you realize that actually the word tribe is quite loaded. Like, you know what I'm saying? It means a particular idea of like primitive, backward, primordial, non-Western people, right? And so, like, we need to think about what it means to align yourself with that term. You know what I'm saying? So these are the kind of debates we get into, which I think is, I think it's a difficult thing to talk about. And it's especially difficult because, you know, I'm not a Zulu speaker. So it becomes very difficult to talk about these things without kind of, one has to kind of reckon with, you have to make that distinction between a kind of talking about the way history works, the way in which we take the evidence and we arrange it in a particular way, and that informs bigger narratives about how we belong in the world. Like the traces of the past, we use that as the base from which to construct our narratives about how we belong in the world, right? And like that's the starting point for how we talk about this. So we don't say like, we don't say the Mfecane was a thing that happened. You know, we say the Mfecane is a way to describe a series of events that have been put together and that have been thought of as contributing to certain changes that happened in the 19th century, right?
So I think like another thing that you're pointing at that you didn't necessarily say is something that kind of happens globally to people who are who come under subjugation or colonization or whatever, and that's the process of essentializing and like making like reducing a native subject to its absolute base essence. And I think a lot of what happens in a lot of the success of British colonialism lies in its capacity to essentialize to the point where it becomes part of the narrative of the people being subjugated. And I don't know. And then the interesting thing that happens after that is that these distinct lines become the basis for kind of discrete nationalisms within a state, right? So like there's like
just explain that again, Bolton. Like
so the process of essentializing happens through decades and centuries of colonialism and subjugation. People are separated by language lines, by kind of really fake but solid borders, and then eventually like nationalisms emerge out of those separate groups, and like like, so in the Western Cape, for instance, we have,
Yeah.
claims to extreme indigeneity, like I am
Yeah.
indigenous to this land,
Yes.
and
Yeah,
I
got
have a
it.
claim to this land, and I, will banish anybody else who doesn't fall within the bounds of this
Became your
definition
first type of
of
thing.
like, yeah. And so I don't know. I just think like a lot of this is a good way. This conversation is a good way to talk to people who say, well, colonialism is in the past and apartheid is in the past, because the line of trajectory is there. Like you can follow. I mean, it's not one line, it's like a fucking web, but you can track the political narratives that give rise to the kind of separatisms, the types of racisms that we have to deal with now, the type of like ethnic mythologies we have to think about and contend with. Yeah. Also, I know this is a undergrad class, but I feel like you could spend like the whole 3 years of your undergrad BA just discussing this. Honestly, like it's so it's such a
Layered.
massive, it's such a exactly, it's so
It's
fucking
such
layered,
it's
bruh.
huge. It's huge. I mean,
Do you think that's why? Sorry.
no, I think like I just wanted to say the other thing that's always like thinking about this stuff always makes me think about, like, for example, how we think about Cape Town, right? And how we forget that, and I don't know how to emphasize this more, but how we forget that Cape Town was a slave society.
Right.
Right? It was a society that at its core, the slave was the backbone of its economy. Right?
Yeah.
And then what happened then was that you had all these different groupings of people, all these different formations of, I don't know what we can call them. Let's not call them ethnicities. Let's call them groupings of people, and the ways in which people name themselves, these groups of people. You have the Griqua, you have the Griqua also giving rise to the term Afrikaner. You have then the emergence of the term colored. And because there is this association with the term, with the idea of a slave as kind of like a as a non-human, as a kind of like beneath human, as I guess the slave living, the slave kind of being socially dead, or socially disappeared in some sense. Like you have a disavowal of that history in favor of a kind of re-embrace of the term colored, right? And then, like in recent years, you have, with the ways in which the idea of blackness in South Africa, through its various kinds of circuits, through black consciousness, and then back to a kind of through the state's idea of rainbow nationalism, through the state's idea of that you have to have diversity on the same grounds that apartheid did, on the same grounds of ethnicity. You have a sudden clamoring towards this idea of First Nation. And there's a lot of colored people saying, like, now we're First Nation, we're indigenous on the same grounds. And when by doing that, it's also a claim to say, like, we were here first. Kind of, it's once again a kind of reduction to the conversation about land, about belonging to the land, about all these kinds of things. And my point is that on some level, it's about, we need to pay attention to the ways in which, like, we talk about things and the way in which we narrate ourselves. Like something that I learned this week that just like blew my mind again, even though I probably heard it before, but it just blew my mind again, was the fact that the statue of Jan van Riebeeck in Cape Town was actually paid for and commissioned by Cecil John Rhodes. Yeah, like it blows your mind to think about that. And in fact, but this is part and parcel, because what happened was that, and this is part of a conversation I think we need to have, is the ways in which we think about these categories as kind of like fixed things that have existed forever, etc., etc. But there was a time in South Africa's history where like the Boer republics were fighting imperialism, right? They thought the British were imperialists, right? Like they like it's weird to think about like, and there was a moment when English and the kind of Afrikaans whiteness were not a homogenous group. And then you had the Van Riebeeck Festival in 1952, the kind of culminating of an Afrikaner nationalist moment, that then recovered this figure, Jan van Riebeeck, who was like discarded, right? He was a nobody he was in the dustbin of history. Like he was a disgraced company official. Nobody knew who he was really. He was brought out as this kind of founding figure of a shared kind of white history of South Africa. And obviously it benefited the interests of figures like Cecil John Rhodes, of mining capital in Johannesburg, to kind of contribute to this moment in which like white kind of nationalism would become the order of the day, or the national kind of narrative of the day, right? So even just that little, like, these categories are, even the category of like, I guess, the histories that we sometimes think are very self-evident have their own structure and narrative structure that we need to uncover and talk about. We need to think about how is it that we understand the past in this way, right? Like what are the traces that we have, and how are those traces kind of organized into something intelligible for us that we then take on and then say, oh no, this is mine now. This is like my forever story kind of thing. You know what I'm saying?
Damn.
Yeah.
That's so damn interesting, bruh. Yeah. It also just makes me think about the fact that, like, you know, during I think it's during the American Civil War, and they are fighting basically the United Kingdom because that they see them as an imperial power, but they're fighting them so that they can continue their practices of slavery unencumbered by the throne, like, you know, the kingdom. And it's just so fucking fascinating, man. So yes, absolutely, these Afrikaners are fighting the British because they are an imperial force, a colonial force. But like there are layers of meaning behind the reasoning for that, and like the logics of that kind of resistance is fucking interesting, man, bro. I don't like it, but it's fucking interesting because it shows itself elsewhere in the world as well. It shows itself in the States, and I'm sure it shows itself many other places, but like, yeah, these are the two examples I can think of right now.
I mean, like, the thing about it also, and I just want to touch on the discomfort, is like it shows us like ideas like liberation, for example, are not necessarily like, we should understand these terms as also having histories of their own, right? Like, and caught up within the way in which you make sense of the world, like so. And also like that these things are also in particular context, right? Like after union, like that idea of like Afrikaner and Boer are two very different categories before union.
Yeah.
Right? And then they start to like become something else as Afrikaner nationalism kind of morphs into something else, right? And at the same time, you've got all these early figures of the ANC who are, I think, like retrospectively taken out of that particular political landscape that they're operating in. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like what does it mean when we think about like a lot of the early nationalist thinkers are often critiqued for their allegiance with the British. But what does it mean in the kind of context of the fact that like here was this other kind of formation, you know, the Boer republics, like a kind of latent Afrikaner nationalism that was also kind of mobilizing. And what did it mean? What did the British then look like as a kind of future, right? Because like, I mean, also something I heard this week, like history is about the future, really. It's about how we make sense of things and how we see ourselves going forward, right? Like, so on some level, like, I feel like early nationalists, African nationalists were also thinking about what does alignment with a certain kind of future mean?
Yeah.
Right? You know, and what does it mean to kind of say to the other future, no thanks? Right? Like, we
You
don't
know,
want that other future.
yeah.
People just did what they could, what they thought best at the time, and like to look back and to kind of like nitpick and say, oh, they were corrupt and they were stupid and this and that. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
what do you expect and understand? A decision had to be made, and
I think one of the and Aiden can speak more to this, and actually you a teacher, but like a lot of what we have to teach when we're teaching undergrad history is actually that you can't apply your like
current day
political
yeah.
and moral logic and say like pass judgment, because that's not useful in the like pursuit of trying to understand these people's stories, but also understand like why we are in the moment that we are now. Another thing I wanted to say that Aiden kind of reminded me of is that, so my father told me, actually my dad's older brother told me once that their dad, before he died, so this was after the apartheid state becomes the apartheid state. One of the main political parties in the Western Cape that could function as any kind of opposition was the Liberal Party. And so my father's father, and this is like a precursor to like a great ancestor of the Democratic Party eventually, and then the DA and so on and so forth. But in its early formation, it was a response to white nationalism. So, but it was the one party where people who were not white could also slot in. Their politics was almost entirely informed by the British Liberal Party as well. So it's very interesting that these kinds of like, we're talking about the early days of the ANC and like why were nationalists in that moment aligning with British folk, but we see pockets of that emerge at other points in like in the history of South Africa as well.
Oh.
And like they used to have like meetings in Ravensmead and like Liberal Party meetings and stuff like that. And eventually it kind of fizzled out, but I don't know. He was in the Second World War. He came back. Your mind would tell you that, he would be like anti-imperial, want to be
All
against
this shit he
everything,
saw.
blah, blah, blah. But for some reason, it made sense to him that the Liberal Party was the line to take, that was the way to be able to critique the state and like to be able to come at the white nationalist Afrikaner state at that point. So I don't know. But I don't know. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I just want like just to respond to like Lee's point about like, people did what they needed to do, etc., etc. Like, I agree. Like, actors in the past, let's call them that, or people do things, people live contradictory lives. I think we must start there. Like, people live contradictory lives, like, contradictory and complex and complicated lives. And the formations that emerge from those contradictory and complicated lives are often complex, contradictory, and very strange formations, right? Like, and I think one of the things that that I'm trying to do, and the way that I've been schooled, and I think Walton can also reflect on this as well, is like, history is not necessarily about like the ways in which we reflect on what people did in the past is also our way of constructing narratives about them in the present. So in a sense, like we are producing that history as we kind of grapple with what we know about the past, right? So history is as much like, I don't like this category of historian because I think on some level we all kind of are trying to do the work of historians. We're trying to make sense of what we know about the past in the present. And that making sense of it in the present is a production of history in the present, right? And that's a very kind of like, it's a disabling idea. I think like if you are an academic and you've like me studied for 10 years, got a PhD, like, you know, I would love to put the category of historian on my little thing, you know, because it's like my skill, whatever. But at the end of the day, like that's a constructed idea of authority, because really, like on some level, history is about how people make sense of the past and the present. And like, I think another thing that needs to be said, just in reflection on your story, Walton, like, you know, like the ANC, like Tsepo Madlinkosi has done this work where he's argued, no, you know, the ANC was also deeply aligned with all sorts of class interests at the time. Like they, at the site of a kind of encroaching kind of colonial attention to land and property and stuff, the ANC, which was more largely formed by a kind of like African elite, right, like a rising middle class, sought alliances with tribal authorities like chiefs and kings, right, to kind of bolster their position to protect their class interests. Now, if you think about it like that, and then suddenly with that in mind, the transition becomes a very interesting thing to think about. Because what is the ANC in some senses but formed out of a certain kind of class interest, right? Like kind of elite interest. And then you think about like the idea, like people are always saying, yeah, you know, like those people really like fucked up at Godessa, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, like if you think about it, like what did you expect?
Right.
What are the class?
Exactly.
What are the class interests of?
You can't apply
Exactly.
today's
Like
logic.
right?
You can't apply the present's logic with situations and in the past. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, but also like I was saying earlier, like these ideas have histories of their own. So you have to kind of track like where does this come from?
Right.
Like what are the kind of, you know, like what happens
Doesn't
if you
just
go
happen.
back step by step, and you kind of you look at the structure of the way in which we talk about these things. How have we framed this? How have we named this? Like what is the ways in which, you know, and then you kind of realize actually, yeah, like something that really blew my mind again this week was this idea that the state is not the government, right? It's a Marxist idea that the state is like the consolidation of class interests, right?
Say that again.
The state is not the government.
Okay.
Right? The government is an arm of the state, right? The state is the consolidation of power around class interests. So what is the interest of a particular class or the ruling class, right? In the case of South Africa, let's talk about
private property.
the interests of capital, you know, the mining capital particularly, the interest of finance capital. Maybe the US is a different example there, actually, with finance capital, right? And the state forms the state as a structure of power, as a structure of authority, consolidates around those interests to protect those interests, and from it produces all sorts of different institutions, right? The university is an institution of the state that teaches a particular kind of, I guess you can call it, ideology about what it means to defend class interests. Now, this is a very crude, like this, I'm crude, like I'm really making this very crude, but the point that I'm making is, if you think about it like that, like things like state capture become very different. You know, things like corruption becomes very different. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, if the state is not the government, if the state is
so then say more about how it becomes different, how the state capture become a different question.
So for example, you think about, so what does it mean to capture the government versus what does it mean to capture the state?
Okay.
Now the language around state capture in the media has been around the capture of the government. It's been a language of corruption, right? And then what is
because we
what
always
is
see the government as the state. I mean, for me now,
Yes,
like
yeah,
before
you
you
see.
even mentioned this,
Yeah.
whenever someone said the state, I always thought
Right.
I think the government.
Yeah.
And you're trying to tell me they are separate.
I'm saying that the government is one arm of the state. The government is an arm of the state that allows that looks after the interests of those who are the ruling class, right? So if you think about state capture, right? If you think about the argument that's been made that the ANC is involved let's say the ANC is involved in state capture. The ANC is the main reason for it. Blah blah blah. The people you prosecute for it are members of the government, because that's now in the understanding that the state is the government. But the minute you dislodge that and you say the government, then you're like, who else is involved in capturing this structure of power called the state and being able to control its resources, right? Well, like, what is finance capital doing? Like, like KPMG, like the auditors, like
if government is one arm of the state, would capital, like, I don't know, finance be another, like private finance, I mean, be another arm of the state? If the state is the seat of power of a particular ruling class, or like what are the other arms of the state then? Is what I'm asking basically.
Think about what would be the structures, the institutions, the ideologies that would
perpetuate or
uphold the interests of the ruling class.
Okay, got it. That's perfect.
Like all those kind of structures. So
the banking system.
A banking system. Like if you've got now obviously, like once again, like this is
damn,
something
Aiden, you're blowing my fucking mind now.
This is something that requires quite a new, like you need to
I'd be non-emotional
for
about
the people
it.
listening to this. Don't take my word for it. Go and look up concepts of the state. Go and think about it a bit more, etc. Because I'm obviously butchering like quite very complex arguments that have very complex.
Right, you don't have the 3-hour lecture space to do this in you.
I also don't have.
And where are your slides?
I said, yeah, exactly. But the point that I'm making is like that's one example of like I think a kind of political literacy, or like a general set. Like we need to understand these terms a bit better. Do you know what I'm saying? Like you think about the history of apartheid, right? And you think about the collusion between the apartheid state and like various like banks, various like state-owned entities. You know what I'm saying? Like all these different things that were colluding to make sure that the apartheid government stayed in power, because they were protecting the interests of, for example, the mining companies, for example. Do you understand?
The property companies, the red zoning, the land distribution, reallocation. So they put these laws and they make these finance laws, property laws, marriage laws, all these things to kind of uphold the ideology that serve the people, that serve the state, and the state is basically the people who want to be kept in power behind the scenes, non-governmental, like people who we don't really see.
We need to fucking abolish the state, maybe.
But
fucking abolish the state. I'm sorry.
But Walton, like if you think of the state as an amalgamation, as a consolidation of all these various kind of structures that serve to protect the interests of the ruling class, how do you abolish the state? Do you know what I'm saying? Like it becomes a very
problem. So this is the thing. Like I would say, and this is like very anti-anarchist of me, I would say revolutionary war and violence would be one of the main steps towards abolishing the state, because so one state doesn't exist and operate in isolation to like global capitalism. that would just be a fallacy and a fantasy, right? Like, so much of what we think about as state capture. I was just thinking that states don't exist in isolation of one another. That so much of what we think about as the capture of the South African state has deep ties to Russia, has deep ties to the United States, has deep ties to the UK.
China.
So if we're going to China, if we're going to abolish the state, it has to be. I mean, I'm very much of the mind that we have to start small, that we all have to do our small part, and it will, like, we can build on that. But like, to answer your question, Aiden, how do we get to the point of abolishing the state? I think they like I think that part of it will have to be revolutionary struggle, and I think this is where the Marxists would be super handy in terms of analysis and stuff like that. But I also think they can only take us so far.
So like Marx's idea would have been that, like, you have the state would first, like, the government would first be replaced by what he calls basically a dictatorship of the proletariat, right? Which is basically a formation of the majority of the kind of not the ruling class, but the underclass, those who have labor, those who are subjected to kind of like selling their labor within the system, right? And then after that, you would have a slow kind of like erosion of the idea of the state. Remember the state with all its kind of institutions, like that would slowly erode away into more democratic forms or more kind of participatory forms of governance, of laws, of welfare, of like basically the anarchist mode, right? Like eventually order will arise from anarchy, right? Like that's the kind of like very crude understanding of anarchy. And I think like if we think about like the history of the Soviet Union, like the kind of overthrow of Tsarist Russia to kind of produce what a dictatorship of the proletariat. Like, I think like it needs to hold up against like the particular form of capitalism. I don't want to say capitalism, or like I feel like it's becoming an empty term, like, but I think like I think like it needs to respond to particular ways in which capitalism has changed. Like if you look at this, like, so when people say the neoliberal state, like what do they mean?
Right? Yes, please.
Like, you know what I'm saying? No, I don't know. Like,
yeah,
I also think it's an interesting. I think it's an interesting
tell me what that means.
Like,
but
okay, what does it mean for you?
I've been in academia for fucking 12 years, and I still hear that term, and I'm like, I don't know what you're saying, but
like okay, it's actually okay. Go ahead. That's fine.
No, go. You go.
I've come across the term in different ways. Like, no talk, bro.
But I talk. I want to hear.
I've come across that term in different like contexts, and then like I'm kind of like, okay, neoliberal state, neoliberalism. Is it like, what is that? Like, you know, and I think shit's changing so quickly, like with the term capitalism, and like how we kind of past that now. And it's like, you know, it's but the language hasn't caught up yet, you know, because how things are structured and how power structures are forming day by day, month by month, is changing into and forming and evolving into new types of things that we will refer to things as capitalism. We will refer to things as neoliberalism or neoliberal state. But to get, what do you guys make of those terms?
Yeah, so I like to think of neoliberalism as a process and a function rather than a category of like political analysis. So I think about it as the complete erasure of responsibility and just this kind of broad spreading bureaucracy and bureaucratic process that eliminates the possibility of people who need things getting them, whether they be answers, services, products, whatever. But it's like this kind of immense spread of administrative and managerial processing. And everybody has a manager all the way up to fucking the moon, maybe. Everybody, there's like,
God.
it's like the endless managerial train, basically, all the way to God. Yeah, God is a neoliberal.
Everyone has a manager. Everyone has a manager all the way up to God, bro. The Pope has a manager. I like that, Milton.
You guys must
remind
me. You guys must remind me to put that David Graeber conversation in the show notes, where he talks about bullshit jobs, because he does a thing about bureaucracy, liberalism, and like managerialism, but also that Greek economist.
Oh yeah.
Lee.
Oh, brass fire. I forgot his name.
And he spoke about like, so he took capitalism. He took a critique of capitalism further than just talking about capitalism itself, but talking about the way
feudalism.
Feudal.
No competition.
Feudal somethingism, and basically it's like a capitalism that has cannibalized itself. Is the way he talks about it. So I'll try and remember to put that in the show notes so that people can see what we're referencing and get some more grounding.
Everyone has a supervisor, and the supervisors have managers, and the managers have cluster managers, and the cluster managers have
we see that in Home Affairs, bruh. Think about Home Affairs as a service, right? What is the function of Home Affairs in South Africa? It's to be able to provide the documents that we need in order to be a functioning citizen in society, like according to like legal governmental structures. But they make it so hard to do that. They make it incredibly hard to do that. Something as simple as getting a copy of your birth certificate is a year and a half long process for some people. So, these things should not be the way they are. Yeah.
It's like you pay, whether it's in time or money, and most likely it's both, to kind of be a citizen, or just like you had no choice to be born, but now you must jump through hoops. And like there are people that can afford to take a day off to go stand in a line for an entire day, but most of South Africa doesn't, or like they don't possess the literacy or the type of filling out forms and asking like for this number, and it's just it's like the type of information you need to give. It's like, bro, I had to go for Lucas's passport or to renew something. I had to give my father's death certificate and my parents' marriage certificate for Lucas's stuff. They need the grandparents. They need the grandparents' documentation. So my mom had to go and fish out. It was just like, why? What's the Now there's now in the rural areas and the far off lying areas. Who has the stuff?
But where I'm staying in Providence. So historically, there has been an opioid issue.
Yes.
But there's also been a kind of homelessness issue in Providence and the surrounds. And a lot of the state social workers come out every day to the main like basically the Belleville station of Providence, like where all the big bus and taxi rank and every, okay, the central spot. They come there almost every day. Basically, all they do is sign people up to get a social security card and to get some other kind of identification as well, so that they can access the services. Now I'm asking myself, what under what condition do we live where we require of a person to present evidence of their existence so that they can access food and a bed in a shelter? Like, why
you're getting
is
into something.
why is that a precondition? Like, and I think about refugees in South Africa who have to go to Home Affairs, and
because
like
resources,
how they are treated. Like,
because resources have to
know,
be tracked and monitored. So that person who's doing that, they have to now document how much work they did.
exactly.
Handing
And
out
then
food,
we back
they
to
need
the
to now
bureaucracy, bruh.
handing out food to people, that needs to be documented. That needs to be, there's checks and balances, because the system works like that. It doesn't work on empathy and just hand the shit out. It works on a numbers game. Like, things
It
need to
just
be
doesn't.
tracked.
Yeah.
I mean, homeless shelters do the same thing, bro.
It makes little sense, bro. It makes
Homeless
such little
shelters, you
sense.
can't access it without the ID.
Yeah, you can't.
You can't access without ID. Now ask a homeless lady or a homeless 17, 18-year-old, where's your ID?
Right.
It's like, yeah, here's it, yeah.
So the funny thing is, like, once again, going back to how we talk about things and the terms we use and stuff, like, what are migrants, foreign nationals, refugees, homeless people, what are they described as? If they don't have papers, what are they described as?
But are you asking me a high school question now? But tell us.
Stateless people.
Stateless people.
Jeez.
Right?
Wow.
That's like very interesting. Right? Like, it's very interesting to me that is the way that you think about that in relation to. So basically, it's someone who is outside of the kind of outside of that system that can kind of that can, it like a stateless person is someone for whom the state has no control over.
Yeah.
Someone the state cannot exert power over. But then it becomes really interesting, because actually, like, implicitly or almost like by effect of the fact that the state cannot control it, the state does control a stateless person in a weird kind of logic, right?
That's yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, that's all I wanted to say. I think
I was just gonna say that that's why I think the city of Cape Town is constantly trying to find houseless and homeless people. Like, is absolutely an attempt to exert absolute control over people who have no capacity to pay a fine. So then, if they get picked up again, they get put in a cell. Like, like what is the?
I mean, like, once again, like, I mean, that is also interesting in the context of Cape Town, because there is a history, and like organizations like Fundau Kwazi and I think Reclaim the City have also pointed this out. Like, you can actually track the kind of bylaws of the city back to like the vagrancy laws of like the 1840s or something that came after slavery ended, right? So this is very interesting, right? So slavery ends, right? And now you have these individuals who can, I guess,
they have agency, maybe.
Agency, but like in an ideal world, they're able to sell their labor, right? And they are able then to access a certain kind of class mobility. Obviously, this is now not as nuanced as it should be, but right. And that poses a threat to the state. The state being the consolidation of the interests of the ruling class. So what does the state do? It pursues laws in order to control.
Oh my God!
Like, can you see how this? Like, just to go, like, I'm being annoying with it now, but just to kind of emphasize the ways in which it's so important to make that distinction. Like, that simple distinction of the state is not the government. Like,
we don't have lobbying, right? South Africa doesn't have lobbying.
I don't think in a public sense we have lobbying, but I think behind the scenes, like, people buy our politicians for votes and stuff all the time.
Because I'm
But
thinking, okay, the government, how do they know what laws need to come into in effect to uphold the interest of the state, right? So do they come
yeah,
to them and say, hey, we need this, we need this, we need this? Then the government
yeah,
says, got it? Because that's how lobbying works, like in the States, right? You fund and you're like, okay, we want these laws to be passed, this, and that. In South Africa, I think it's almost kind of more sinister because it's so ducked and it's so hidden. And that's why parties are also not reluctant to show their funding there. One of the Oppenheimer's daughters funded the DA's last campaign. I think it was like 20, 30 mil or something like that. And that's where Aiden comes in. Like, okay, that's that. Now I see how the government is not the state, but there to serve the interests of the state. And Johan Rupert as
yep.
well. I mean, if South Africa was such a terrible
Ah,
place to live, why that man would have been gone. You know what I mean? Like people are like, oh, South Africa's bad. That why are then the richest families in South Africa that have been living there for the last century still there? Their children are
yeah.
still there. You know, if everyone's moving out to give a better future for their children, why are these people not, even though they can afford to go buy a mansion in maybe Mozambique or in go to Portugal or something? It's because the interest of being served, right? So now everything's making sense. And
But
it's actually,
but I think it's been an hour.
Look, I do.
Say go
Before you,
Aiden,
before you
and then I
close, I
want to
just want
wrap
to say,
up.
like, I think we need to talk about this again because I think we need to talk about techno-feudalism at some point. Like, I think
hey,
that's
bro.
Yeah,
that Yanis Yarovakis, I don't know how to pronounce
There we
the
go.
person's surname.
There we go.
yeah,
But yeah, that concept of techno-feudalism, I think like we need to think about the state there, right? Because now the state
yes,
and the corporation become very, very close. But I
Very
will leave
yes.
close.
that for the next episode or another chapter.
Hell yes. This was a
That's
Can we talk
dope
about that next,
talk.
please? Can we talk about
Yeah,
that
Yeah,
we can
next?
definitely talk
yeah.
about
That
that.
was
Right.
this was so good. Starting
Hey, now
from
I'm gonna
like
go freak out now. I'm gonna go
from
freak
Zulu
out.
history all the way to here, Pedro.
Right.
I just want to say thank you to Aiden and Lee and Andriek in his absence for an amazing recording. We're gonna put a bunch of stuff in the show notes. Follow us on Twitter at JXC Podcast, on Instagram at JXC Podcast, and on Facebook at Jelly and Custard. Yeah, check us out on YouTube, Anchor, Spotify, iTunes, all the things. And I am going to go look after a dog because my university doesn't pay me well. Cheers.
Cheers, man.
But for real, I'm gonna go look after. I'm gonna go work
Dogs.
my side hustle. Love
Are
you
you, are
guys.
you like
thing,
are you
bro.
like walking the dogs also?
Yeah,
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's
yeah,
cool.
everything, bro.
Okay.
Cats, dogs, goldfish, parakeet,
But you
parrots,
wash you
beer
wash those
cats.
goldfish. You yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Love you
Bye.
guys.
Love
Bye.
you too. Bye.